He lost someone, and he didn't cry. Not because he didn't care, because something inside him had stopped working. There's a moment in war nobody talks about. Not the first combat, not the first loss. It's the moment you realize you can't feel anything anymore. And that, more than any bullet, is what breaks you. James Crawford lost a man named Miller. Not in a dramatic firefight, not with final words and a hero's goodbye. Just a mortar, just a silence. And then, Miller was gone. James sat next to him for 10 minutes. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat there, waiting for something to happen inside him. Nothing came, and that nothing scared him more than any explosion ever had. The mortar. James is 22 years old. He's been at the front for 6 months. He's seen men fall. He's heard the noises they make, the gurgle of a punctured lung, the whispered name of a mother, the long, slow exhale that doesn't come back. He thought he was ready for anything. Then came the mortar. It landed 30 meters away, close enough to shake the ground, close enough to send shrapnel singing through the air. When the dust cleared, Miller was on the ground. No blood, no wound you could see, just his eyes open, his mouth slightly parted, and no sound. James crawled to him, grabbed his shoulder, shook it. Miller, come on. Nothing. The eyes didn't move, the chest didn't rise. Later, the medic said it was the blast, the shockwave. It doesn't always leave a mark on the outside, but inside, everything shuts down, like a switch flipped, like someone unplugged a lamp. Miller died without a word, without a warning, without giving anyone a chance to say goodbye. James sat next to him for 10 minutes before he understood. That's the part he can't forget. Not the death, the silence, why he didn't cry. Here's what nobody tells you about tears in combat. They don't come when you expect them. They don't come when the death happens. They come later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes never. James didn't cry at Miller's body. He didn't cry that night. He didn't cry the next day. He didn't cry when he wrote the letter to Miller's wife. The letter someone else had to dictate because his hands were shaking too much to hold the pen. He wanted to cry. He tried to cry. He sat alone in the dark and waited for the tears to come. Nothing. Psychologists call this emotional shutdown. The brain, overwhelmed by too much trauma, too much death, too much grief, simply turns off the faucet. Not because you don't feel, because you feel too much. And the brain decides that feeling nothing is safer than feeling everything. James didn't cry because he couldn't. His brain had locked that door, and he didn't have the key. The picture Miller had shown him a picture of his wife that morning. "She's pregnant," he said, "due in 4 months. I'm going to be a dad." James had smiled, said congratulations, clapped him on the back. 2 hours later, he was holding that same man's shoulder, shaking it, begging for a response that would never come. The picture was still in Miller's pocket. James saw it later, a corner of it sticking out. He didn't take it. He couldn't. Someone else would have to do that. Someone else would have to write the letter. Someone else would have to tell a pregnant woman that her husband wasn't coming home. James just sat there, in the silence. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because of the explosions. Those had become background noise by now. He couldn't sleep because of the absence of them. The quiet felt wrong, like a room where a clock stopped ticking. You don't notice the tick until it's gone. Then you can't stop noticing. He kept listening for Miller's voice, for a laugh, for a cough, for anything. There was nothing, and that nothing followed him. into the next battle, into the next camp, into every quiet moment for the rest of the war. What silence does. Here's what silence does to a soldier. It stays. A scream you can process. A scream means pain. Pain means alive. Pain means something happened that your brain can file away. It's horrible, but it's noise. And noise fades. Silence doesn't fade, because silence is empty, and your brain doesn't know what to do with empty. So it fills it, over and over, with questions, with guilt, with the moment replayed 1,000 times. Could I have reached him faster? Did I miss something? Was he calling for help and I just didn't hear? You will never know. That's what silence takes from you. Certainty. James thought about Miller every day after that. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way he could explain. Just a small thought, a quiet presence. He'd be walking patrol, and he'd think, Miller would hate this mud. He'd be eating cold rations, and he'd think, Miller used to trade his bread for my chocolate. He'd be lying in his bunk, and he'd think, Miller never got to see his kid. No screams, no tears, just thoughts. Small, quiet, endless thoughts. That's what silence leaves behind. Not grief you can point to, but grief you can't escape. Because it's not one big thing. It's 1,000 tiny ones. And they never stop. The tears came later. The tears didn't come at the funeral. They didn't come at the memorial. They didn't come when James got home and saw his own father for the first time in 2 years. They came on a Tuesday afternoon, 17 years after the war ended. James was driving home from work. A song came on the radio, something his mother used to play, and for no reason at all, he thought of Miller, of the picture, of the pregnant wife, of the child who never knew his father. He pulled over to the side of the road, and he cried for 20 minutes, alone in his car, 17 years late. That's the thing about emotional shutdown. The tears don't disappear. They just wait, sometimes for decades, until the brain finally decides it's safe enough to feel again. James didn't cry when he lost Miller. He cried 17 years later, and he cried for every man he had lost in between, every name he had filed away, every silence he had carried. The tears came, just not when anyone was watching, not when anyone could help, just him and a radio and the side of a road. Here's what James learned from not crying. Tears are not the measure of grief. The men who cry at the funeral are not the ones who loved more. The men who stay dry-eyed are not the ones who loved less. Grief lives in the body, in the sleepless nights, in the sudden stops on the side of the road, in the thoughts that come out of nowhere, years later, when you least expect them. James didn't cry when Miller died, but he carried Miller with him every day for the rest of his life, in the small thoughts, in the quiet moments, in the weight of silence that never fully lifted. That was his grief, not tears, just presence, just memory, just a man who stayed gone and a man who stayed behind, trying to figure out how to keep going. Every episode of war inside the head tracks what combat does to the brain, not the explosions, the silence afterward, not the trauma, the transformation. Next episode, the kill that felt like nothing. If this stayed with you, hit subscribe, because some wars never end.